The Ghost in the Family Tree, Chapter 1, A Shard of Memory. Eleanor Vance, a woman of 78, found solace in the quiet rituals of her retirement in a cozy, sun-drenched home in Asheville, North Carolina. Her days were a gentle blend of gardening, reading, and cherished visits from her grandson, 15-year-old Leo. Leo, with his bright eyes and insatiable curiosity, was a budding genealogist, fascinated by family history. He spent hours poring over old documents, digital archives, and faded photographs, meticulously piecing together the branches of their family tree. Eleanor, though amused by his youthful obsession, indulged him, offering snippets of her own past, mostly pleasant, uncomplicated recollections. One crisp autumn afternoon, Leo burst into her living room, a large, intricate family tree poster unfurled triumphantly in his hands. "Grandma Ellie, look what I found. Our branch on your father's side goes back to the 1700s. And look at this picture." His finger jabbed excitedly at a sepia-toned photograph pasted near the base of a particularly ancient branch. Eleanor leaned closer, her reading glasses perched on her nose. It was a photograph of a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, with kind, earnest eyes and a shock of sandy blonde hair falling across his forehead. He wore a simple, rough-spun shirt, his gaze direct and open. The photo was slightly faded, but the details were remarkably clear. Leo had placed the name Elias Thorne, born 1910, beneath it, along with a connection to a distant cousin through her great-grandmother's line. Eleanor's breath hitched, her hand flew to her mouth, a small gasp escaping her lips. The air in the room seemed to thin, the sunlight suddenly dimming. Her vision swam, not from age, but from a sudden, visceral jolt, a memory so sharp it felt like a physical wound. She hadn't seen that face in over 70 years, yet it was as vivid as if she had seen him yesterday. "Grandma, are you okay?" Leo's voice, full of youthful concern, broke through her haze. No, I'm not," Eleanor whispered, her voice reedy and thin. She pointed a trembling finger at the photograph. "Leo, where did you find this picture?" "Online, Grandma, on that old family history site. It was uploaded by a distant cousin." "A great-granddaughter of Elias Thorne. Why, do you know him?" Eleanor's eyes were fixed on the face, the kind eyes, the gentle smile. "Know him?" she repeated, her voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming grief that felt as fresh as the day it happened. "Leo, I knew him. I knew him intimately." She swallowed hard, the taste of dust and sorrow filling her mouth. "Leo, that's Elias, my brother." Leo blinked, confused. "Your brother? Grandma, you never mentioned a brother. And the dates. This Elias Thorne was born in 1910. He'd be over 100. I thought your only sibling was Aunt Susan." "He was my older brother," Eleanor insisted, her voice gaining strength, infused with an old, aching pain. "Elias, he was 12 years older than me, my parents' firstborn. He was killed when I was 5 years old. I remember it. I remember the funeral. I remember them putting him in the ground." Her voice cracked on the last word, tears welling in her eyes, hot and sudden. "We buried Elias. He's buried right here in the old family plot, just outside of town. I visit his grave every year." Leo stared at the picture, then back at his grandmother, his face a mixture of disbelief and growing alarm. "But Grandma, the source for this photo, it says this Elias Thorne lived until 1985. He died in California, and he had a family, daughters, grandchildren. He pointed to other names and dates on the family tree. He moved to California in the late 1930s. He became a successful engineer. He even has a great-granddaughter, Clara Thorne, who uploaded this very picture. Eleanor felt a cold wave wash over her, a profound sense of disorientation. The man in the photograph, the boy she had mourned, the brother she had buried in her childhood memory, couldn't possibly have lived to a ripe old age, had a family, and died in California. It was impossible. It defied her most fundamental, traumatic childhood memory. Yet the photograph was undeniably Elias. Her Elias. The eyes were his. The hair, his. "No," she whispered, shaking her head vehemently. "No, that's not right. Elias died. He died in a fire. I saw him. They brought him home. My mother, she never recovered. My father, he changed after that." Her voice trailed off, lost in the fog of a memory so deeply ingrained it felt like bedrock. Leo, sensing the depth of his grandmother's distress, gently laid the family tree on the coffee table. "Grandma, this is a real person, with real records. His death certificate, his marriage certificate, his census records. They all match this Elias Thorne. Born 1910, died 1985, Los Angeles, California." Eleanor picked up the photograph, her fingers tracing the kind face. It was Elias. It had to be. But if he lived, if he had a family, if he became an engineer in California, then whose grave was she visiting every year? Who had she mourned for 73 years? Who had her parents buried with such profound, shattering grief? The world she had known, built on the solid ground of her childhood memories, suddenly felt like shifting sand. This wasn't just a genealogical discovery. It was a ghost from her past, resurrected from the dead, challenging the very fabric of her family's history and her own identity. And a chilling question began to form in her mind. What if her family hadn't been honest with her about Elias's death? What unspeakable secret had they buried, not just in the ground, but in the deepest parts of her memory? She knew with a sudden, overwhelming certainty that she had to find the truth. Chapter 2. The Buried Truth. The image of Elias, alive and well in Leo's family tree, became an obsession for Eleanor. It gnawed at her, a persistent ache, undermining every memory of her childhood. The grief she had carried for decades, the sympathy for her parents' lifelong sorrow over their lost firstborn, it all twisted into a knot of confusion and a terrible sense of betrayal. Had her parents lied to her? Why? And how could they have faked a death, a funeral, so convincingly? Leo, seeing his grandmother's profound distress, offered to help. He was accustomed to the thrill of a genealogical mystery, but this was different. This was raw, deeply personal. Together, they began to unravel the threads of Elias Thorne's supposed death. Eleanor remembered the fire. It had been in the family's barn, a small, sudden blaze. Elias, as the eldest son, was always helping her father with chores. She remembered the smoke, the shouting, the terror. And then, the devastating news. Elias was gone, trapped in the fire. His body, they said, was too badly burned to be recognizable. But her father swore it was him, from a personal item found in the wreckage. They started with the local records. The old county courthouse, dusty and quiet, held faded newspapers from the early 1930s. Leo, with his keen eye, found it. A small article on page 3 of the Asheville Citizen-Times, dated October 12, 1933. Local boy dies in tragic barn fire. The article described the fire on the Thorne family farm, mentioning the family's devastation over the loss of their eldest son, Elias Thorne, age 23. It noted that the body, though badly burned, was identified by family members through personal effects. Eleanor's blood ran cold. It matched her memory. The date, the details, the confirmation of a tragic death. But then, Leo found something else. A small, almost imperceptible detail. A follow-up article, buried on an inner page a week later, noted, "Barnfire victims' remains sent for further identification," and a brief mention of a small piece of metal, possibly a military dog tag fragment, found near the remains, suggesting a link to a transient worker who had briefly been employed on a neighboring farm. "Grandma," Leo said, pointing to the obscure paragraph, "this is weird. Why would they need further identification if they already confirmed it was Elias? And a military dog tag. Was Elias in the military?" Eleanor shook her head. "No, Elias was too young for the Great War, and it was before World War II. He never joined the military. He was always here on the farm." The revelation of this small, contradictory detail was like a hairline crack in the wall of Eleanor's ingrained memory. It suggested doubt, a deviation from the absolute certainty her parents had projected. Next, they sought out the official death certificate. It was dated October 1933, confirming Elias Thorne as the deceased. But under cause of death, it simply stated fire, identity confirmed by family. No medical examiner's report, no detailed forensic findings. This was a time and place where such things were often less stringent, especially in rural areas during the Depression. Families just wanted to bury their dead. Then, Leo made a crucial discovery. On the online genealogy site, he found a digitized copy of Elias Thorne's high school yearbook from 1928. Among the senior portraits, there he was, Elias unmistakably. But in the same digital archive, a few pages later, was a local newspaper clipping from 1934, almost a year after Elias's supposed death. It was an advertisement for a talented young electrician available for hire, with a small, blurry photograph. The face was older, leaner, but the eyes were undeniably Elias's, and the name beneath the advertisement, E. Thorne. Eleanor stared at the clipping, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm. He was alive. He was alive a year after his funeral. The confirmation was irrefutable. Her brother, Elias, whom she had mourned for over 70 years, had lived. The truth began to coalesce, painful and unsettling. Her parents, they had engineered this. But why? Eleanor remembered her parents' deep, desperate grief after the fire. Her mother, usually strong, had withered. Her father, a stoic man, had become withdrawn, haunted. They had been devastated. Could it be that they too were victims of a deception rather than its perpetrators? She remembered a phrase her mother used to whisper in the years after the fire, when she thought Eleanor wasn't listening. He had to go, to save himself, to save us all. Eleanor had always dismissed it as a fragment of her mother's grief-addled mind. Now, it resonated with a chilling new meaning. Eleanor decided to visit the local historical society, a small, cluttered building filled with local lore. The kindly archivist, Mrs. Henderson, a woman who had known Eleanor's family for generations, greeted her warmly. Eleanor, trembling, explained her discovery, showing the photographs and documents. Mrs. Henderson's face, initially perplexed, slowly softened into a look of deep understanding, tinged with sorrow. "Oh, Eleanor, child," she whispered, her voice laced with empathy. "So you finally unearthed the truth. I always wondered if anyone would." And then Mrs. Henderson began to speak, weaving a tale of a forgotten time, a desperate secret, and a family's agonizing choice. "Your father, Thomas Thorne, was a good man, Eleanor, but he was a stubborn one, and he had a secret burden that few knew. He had a gambling problem, a serious one. During the height of the Depression, he got deeply involved with a dangerous group of loan sharks, part of a criminal syndicate that operated throughout the Appalachian region. He owed them a fortune, more than he could ever pay." Eleanor listened, stunned. Her stoic, honest father, a gambler, a debt to criminals? "The thugs came to the farm, Eleanor," Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice hushed. "They threatened your family. Your mother, Martha, she was terrified. They said if your father didn't pay, they would take everything, the farm, and they would harm Elias. Elias was bright, handsome, full of promise. They knew he was your father's pride. They threatened to make an example of him." Eleanor's blood ran cold. This explained her mother's whispers. To save himself, to save us all. Your mother, Martha, she was a brilliant woman, Eleanor, resourceful, desperate. She devised a plan. The fire, it was no accident. She started it. Just a small fire in an old, unused part of the barn. Enough to create chaos, to provide a cover. And she and your father hid Elias. They put some old rags, a few small animal bones, some of Elias's personal effects, a button from his coat, his old pocket knife, in the ashes of the fire, enough to convince the authorities and the loan sharks that a body had been found, burned beyond recognition. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea, a fake death, a staged funeral. Her parents had done this. They used the military dog tag fragment. It was from a transient worker, a drifter who had passed through their fields weeks before and had actually died in a nearby accident just days before the fire. They planted it, knowing it would confuse the official records and further obscure the identity of the body. They sold off a small portion of the land, enough to pay off the most dangerous of the debts, to buy Elias time. They sent Elias away, Eleanor, far away, to California where he had a distant, trusting aunt. He was told to never look back, never contact them, to build a new life, under a slightly altered name if necessary, to pretend he was dead to the world he left behind. It was the only way to protect him, and to protect the rest of the family from the thugs who would still be looking for their money, for revenge. Your parents believed that if Elias was truly gone, the threat would eventually dissipate. They lived with that agonizing secret, the profound lie, every single day to keep you safe. Eleanor could barely breathe. The weight of her parents' sacrifice, the agonizing choices they made, crushed her. They hadn't lied to her out of malice, but out of a desperate, terrifying love. They had buried their eldest son, not physically, but in their hearts, mourning his absence, celebrating his survival in secret, while living a lie to protect their remaining family. The grave she visited wasn't empty. It was a monument to their impossible choice, a silent testament to a life saved by a staged death. The family tree, meant to clarify, had instead unearthed a secret so profound. It redefined her entire understanding of her origins and the extraordinary courage of her parents. She now knew, with an agonizing certainty, that she had to find Elias, if he was still alive. Chapter 3. reaching across time. The truth, raw and shattering, settled over Eleanor with the weight of decades. Her parents, not perpetrators of a cruel deception, but victims of desperate circumstances, forced to make an agonizing choice. They had orchestrated Elias's death, not to harm her, but to save him, to save them from the ruthless grip of loan sharks during the unforgiving era of the Great Depression. The grave she had visited all these years was a monument to their profound sacrifice, a silent scream of a secret love that lived on despite the imposed silence. The immediate relief that her parents hadn't intentionally misled her was quickly replaced by a profound sorrow for their unimaginable burden. To live with such a secret, to mourn a living child, to witness their youngest child grieve for a brother who was still alive, it was a torment beyond comprehension. Eleanor and Leo, now bound by this extraordinary secret, redirected their genealogical quest. Their mission was no longer merely to find Elias Thorne's true lineage, but to find Elias Thorne himself. Leo, with his uncanny knack for online research, located Clara Thorne, the great-granddaughter who had originally uploaded Elias's photo to the genealogy site. She lived in Sacramento, California. Eleanor's hand trembled as she composed the email. How do you explain to a stranger that their deceased great-grandfather, whom they knew as a quiet engineer, was actually a boy who had been publicly declared dead and mourned for decades by his original family? It sounded insane. She attached the relevant documents, the Asheville newspaper clipping about the fire, the ambiguous death certificate, and finally, the electrician's advertisement from 1934 showing Elias alive. She ended the email with a heartfelt plea for understanding and connection, explaining her identity as Eleanor Vance, his younger sister. The reply came 2 days later, not from Clara, but from Clara's mother, Evelyn Thorne. The email was cautious, skeptical, but clearly intrigued. Evelyn Thorne, a woman in her late 60s, explained that her grandfather, Elias, rarely spoke of his childhood. He had always been intensely private about his early life, merely stating he had left North Carolina under difficult circumstances and built a new life for himself. He had carried a quiet melancholy throughout his life, a sadness they had always attributed to the hardships of the Depression. The email attachment included a scanned copy of Elias's personal journal, bequeathed to Evelyn upon his death, with strict instructions to read it only after his passing. Elias, it seemed, had anticipated that the truth might one day surface. The journal was a fragile, leather-bound volume, digitized by Evelyn Thorne. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened the file. The early entries were sparse, formal. But as Elias matured, his voice emerged, articulate, poetic, and filled with a deep, pervasive sorrow. The first relevant entry was dated 1933, months after his death. October 1933, California. I am alive, but I am dead. My parents, God bless their desperate souls, have sent me away. They told me I must never return, never contact them, to save them, to save myself. The debt collectors, they would have killed me, or worse, tortured my father, my mother. My little Eleanor, my sweet little sister, she must think I am gone, dead in the fire. They say they staged it well. My mother, Martha, brave and brilliant, made the plan. My father, Thomas, broken but resolute, carried it out. I am alive, and my heart is breaking, to be separated from them forever, to know my little sister will grow up mourning a ghost. This is my burden now, my penance, to live the life they saved for me, even if it means dying to the life I left behind. Eleanor sobbed, tears streaming down her face. His pain, so palpable across the decades, was a mirror of her own. He had carried the grief of separation, the guilt of his survival, his parents' sacrifice for his entire life. He had thought of her, his little Eleanor, growing up mourning him. Subsequent entries chronicled his lonely early years in California, his quiet success as an engineer, his cautious marriage, his joy in his daughters, including Evelyn Thorne's mother. But always there was an underlying current of melancholy, a sense of incompleteness. 1955. My daughter, Martha, asked me about my childhood today, about my family back east. I told her tales of growing up on a farm, vague, sanitized stories. How can I tell her the truth? That her grandfather, Thomas, was a gambler? That her grandmother, Martha, was a brilliant woman forced to stage her own son's death? That I have a little sister, Eleanor, who thinks I am buried in a shallow grave in North Carolina? This secret, it binds me, it suffocates me, but it keeps them safe. My original family. They must never know I lived. My heart aches for them, especially for little Eleanor. Is she happy? Did she forget me? Does she ever wonder about the brother she buried? Eleanor, reading this, felt her heart twist. He hadn't forgotten her. He had carried her in his thoughts, his quiet grief, his daily penance. The final entry, dated shortly before his death in 1985, December 1984. My time is short. The doctors give me months. I have lived a full life here, a good life, but a life with a gaping wound. I never stopped loving my parents or my little sister, Eleanor. I wonder if she ever knew the truth. If she ever understood why I had to die to her. I leave this journal for my family here, my daughters. Perhaps one day, a generation removed, the truth can be known. Perhaps a little girl named Eleanor will find my picture on a family tree and wonder. If she does, tell her I loved her. Tell her I always did. Tell her I never forgot. Eleanor finished reading, the digital pages blurring through her tears. He had lived a life of quiet longing, a shadow of loss always hovering. His death had been a lifeline, saving him, but costing him the very family he was desperate to protect. And now, 72 years later, the truth had finally found its way home. Eleanor immediately called the number Evelyn Thorne had provided. The voice on the other end was hesitant. Then, as Eleanor introduced herself, filled with an astonished awe. Eleanor? My grandfather's sister? You're alive? Yes, Evelyn. And Elias, my brother, he's alive in my heart now, more than he ever was. They spoke for hours. Evelyn Thorne shared stories of Elias's later life, his quiet demeanor, his kindness, his passion for engineering, his love for his family. Eleanor shared stories of their childhood, of the playful, protective big brother Elias had been. They filled in the 70-year gap, two branches of a family tree, separated by a desperate act, finally reconnecting. A few weeks later, Eleanor flew to Sacramento. Leo accompanied her, witness to this extraordinary reunion. Meeting Evelyn Thorne and her family was like stepping into a parallel universe, a life Elias had built in secret. They embraced, tears flowing freely, two generations finally connecting through the ghost of a shared past. They visited Elias's grave in a quiet California cemetery. This time, Eleanor stood by the headstone of a man she knew had truly lived, a man whose life, though separated by an ocean of secrecy, had always been intertwined with hers. She placed a small, polished stone on his grave, a silent promise that his sacrifice and his parents' agony would never again be forgotten. The family tree, which had shattered Eleanor's world, had ultimately brought her a profound sense of peace. The man she buried in her childhood was alive in her family's memory, a testament to extraordinary love and impossible choices. Her world had expanded, filled with new family, new understanding, and a healed heart. The ghost in the family tree had finally found his way home, not just to a distant relative's computer screen, but to the very heart of the sister who had unknowingly mourned him for a lifetime.